Broncos country, welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. As always, I'm your host, Sydney Jones, and for today's episode, I'm coming to you from Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine. We'll take a look at the top storylines surrounding head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton's press conferences. All that and more coming up. We're taking Broncos Now on the road this week as I'm here in Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine. We heard today from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Paton as they addressed the media and detailed where the team is at this point in the offseason and what they're looking forward to most this week at the Combine.
It's always good to be down in Indy, and it's another important step in the process, obviously. We just finished a busy 2 weeks. We had our scouts in 2 weeks ago. We had, 8 days of draft meetings, and then before we came, we had free agent meetings. Do feel like we're ahead of the game this year. Last year at this time, we're still, finalizing our coaching staff. We didn't have free agent meetings till after the Combine. Sean wasn't able to sit in the draft meetings, so feel good with where we're at. Look forward to a productive offseason.
We're looking for goal-driven players, athletes that are unselfish to some degree, and then I would say that one trait is that we use that term grit a lot, but that ability to get up time and time again, overcome adversity. It's a little bit more challenging now with the portal. Like, I started thinking to myself, how many times when I was in school that I would have loved to jump into a portal, upset or disappointed or mad or whatever, had a bad practice, but those traits still exist, and I think those are important traits when we're visiting with young athletes.
Both Sean and George also talked about what they're looking for specifically when evaluating quarterbacks this week.
The first thing is getting to put a name with a face, and it's the first personal visit where you're like, nice to meet you, and then you'll spend time with questions, and there'll be football related, and there'll be follow-up meetings, pro day visits, private workout visits. And so these are all like pieces of the equation that I think are necessary. And obviously the beginning of this event was to combine medical information, hence the term combine. And then pretty soon, let's run a 40 and let's run a few of these cone drills. And let's have these meetings. But the interactions in the meetings are important because it is for a lot of us, the scouts maybe not so much, but for a lot of us, it's the first time we're getting introduced to a prospect. And so not just at quarterback, but at the other positions. And I think that first impression is important.
You just want to get around them as much as you can. I was fortunate to see, a lot of these quarterbacks during the fall, and that's one step of the process. And then you have the all-star games, and then you have the combine, and then you have pro days and maybe private workouts. So as much as you can get around them and see what makes them tick. Sean talked about leadership. What's the day-to-day like? What do their teammates feel about them? You can evaluate the arm strength, the accuracy, the athleticism. Being able to process is a little more difficult. But I think the more you can get around them, the better decisions, you'll make.
Sean Payton went on to talk about how that evaluation process has changed for him over the years.
I think the receiver position's difficult. There are a lot of misses there. And the quarterback position's difficult. Sometimes, and this is not just recent, and we go all the way back to, the run and shoot. And we can list a number of guys that were successful that we didn't expect to be successful and guys that weren't. And I think that oftentimes the systems that they're in can be difficult to evaluate. It's harder to find good inside linebackers anymore. It used to be difficult to evaluate offensive tackles because teams were running, option football, veer schemes, wishbone, or what have you. Now we get great film in evaluating whether guys can pass protect or not. But then conversely, we get more difficult film at other positions. To your point with quarterbacks, I think that I think one thing that's hard to measure is their ability to multitask and process and make decisions. It's one thing, like you can visit with someone and, they can be intelligent, but man, how quickly can they deliver the information and how quickly can they get through the progression? Are they accurate? There's some fundamental things that we have to see that are present. And so sometimes it's not as difficult as we make it out to be. And then sometimes, listen, it's very difficult. And so I think we'll be really good at this. And I think to some degree, we're glad that a lot of people aren't.
Plus, George Payton discussed how the Broncos plan to approach free agency this year.
We're going to be Mike, like we said, we're going to be strategic. We're not going to be as aggressive as last year. We have flexibility, but we're going to, just be more measured and try to fill specific, positions, specific needs, throughout the team. But feel like we'll have the flexibility to do that. But we're not going to be like, we can't do that every year and be aggressive like we were last year.
Now joining me here on Broncos Now for today's episode from Indianapolis is Broncos lead writer Eric Dalala. Eric, thanks for joining me today. Great to be here at the Combine.
Got it. Said we hit the road for this one.
I know, we did. It's been fun so far. Eric, we heard early in the show from head coach Sean Payton and general manager George Payton. To start with Sean's press conference, what was your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, it was all about the quarterback position, right? I think the biggest news is that within the next couple of weeks, the Broncos are going to make a decision on Russell Wilson's future, his status. But I was also interested hearing all about the quarterback evaluation process and what's so important to Sean Payton when he looks for a quarterback, especially a young quarterback in the draft. And he mentioned there's a lot of things: accuracy, leadership, the build, the makeup from a physical standpoint that you shouldn't miss on. And then there's all the stuff that kind of is maybe harder to measure, less tangible in terms of being able to process and take control at the line of scrimmage, call the play the right way, process quickly. Again, and those things are harder to figure out.
Yeah.
And so that's what this meeting room time is for, to start to get an idea of what that's all about, how these guys do. And Sean said, listen, it can be really difficult to figure that out, but I think we're good at it, and I think we're happy that some other teams are not so good at it. And so clearly the Broncos feel like they have an advantage there in terms of evaluating that position.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting, Eric, to hear both Sean and George also talk about how the evaluation process of a quarterback has really changed over the past couple of years too, especially for Sean, who's been coaching for a very long time.
Yeah, offenses are different, and what guys are asked to do is different. I think some of the college offense has to do with that. But at the end of the day, he said a lot of things still stay the same for as much as they've changed. You still want a guy that's accurate. You still want a guy that can maybe move a little bit outside of the pocket. But he did say you've got to be able to win from the pocket because teams are going to force you to do that. You still got to process. He said once it was a mini camp and guy got up there and he could just tell right away this wasn't the guy they thought they were getting. And so clearly that's going to be, when you hear him talk about the quarterback position, that processing element is clearly the number one thing that the Broncos will be looking for.
Yeah. Well, Eric, now on to George's press conference. What was the big thing that really stuck out to you?
Yeah, I think two things from George. One, the salary cap. It took a big jump from where people expected it to be to where it ended up. I think the key there from George was it gives this team flexibility and that they had a plan for, okay, here's the projected salary cap. Here's what we think we're going to be able to do. And George did say we were going to be able to meet our needs regardless, but now you've got a little bit more flexibility, and that it can either help you this year, maybe it helps you next year planning for the future. But every team gets helped the same amount, right? Because the salary cap goes up. But for the Broncos, it does feel particularly beneficial given where they sit with the salary cap. The other thing was the free agent plan, and that was just kind of an echo of what he said after the season of the Broncos are not going to be swinging for the fence on day one. It's not going to be like last year when the Broncos really went out and got a bunch of guys in that first wave. They're going to be strategic. They're still going to fill needs, Sid, and that doesn't mean they're not going to be active in free agency, but signing 4 big-ticket guys day one, probably not the path this year. So, we're a few weeks removed from the season, and certainly things can change, but George kind of re-emphasized that that's still the plan there as we head into free agency in just a couple weeks.
Just a couple weeks. It's coming up before we know it. Eric, I know George also talked about how beneficial it's going to be this year having the same coaching staff for 2 years in a row. We haven't seen that in recent years. How important do you think that really is going to be this year?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, I can only imagine how difficult it is. Yeah. George comes in, you got Vic Fangio, make a change to Nathaniel Hackett, make a change to Sean Payton, and so you're drafting players for different coaches. It's like you're buying ingredients for one chef and then somebody else comes in. It's just hard to make that work. And when you have consistency with the same head coach, with the same system, obviously Vance Joseph back as defensive coordinator, that can only help. And plus, it's not just the way guys fit, but George knows more now about what Sean Payton is looking for. He said a couple months ago, hey, I know exactly what Sean Payton wants at the quarterback position. Those are big things as you're trying to build a team, and we've heard so much, right, about stability and the value of that, and it is really hard, I think, to find success when you're constantly changing at those positions and when you're not quite sure, is there going to be that stability year to year? And so being able to build a roster that kind of has that, just that line through it of, hey, George has been here, Sean has been here, George knows what Sean's looking for, we're going to go find those players. That's important, and it allows guys to develop. So, another thing Sean said was Marvin Mims, we think, has great potential at receiver, and really was on the coaching staff for not using him as much as a receiver last year. But, hey, year two, same system. Marvin Mims can get better. Drew Sanders, those are the types of guy, Riley Moss. I mean, those are the types of guys that can benefit from consistency. And so it's not just about this year's draft class, Sid. It's about last year's draft class as well, taking a step forward.
Yeah. Well, Eric, as we know, the road to the draft really starts here at the Combine. We've talked a lot about the quarterback position, but what other positions do you think George and his staff, Sean, will take a look at this week?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of areas where you could look and say, hey, the Broncos could use a playmaker here. Cornerback, you could always use more depth there. George mentioned that. He mentioned up front, stopping the run, so that could be interior defensive line. Could that be a linebacker, an edge guy? Certainly with the production the Broncos got last year at tight end, that could be an option. Obviously, there's only one guy there that really speaks to people from a first-round grade, but certainly later in the draft that could be valuable. And then I think you're always looking at receivers and guys that can make big plays, find guys that offensively are weapons for whoever's at the quarterback position. So kind of a hedge there, Sid, but I think the exciting thing is because the Broncos have not had these early picks in recent years, they could go a lot of different directions and still make a big impact, a big upgrade on this football team. And so maybe we'll get a little more clarity after free agency, but right now, Sid, I think there's a lot of paths the Broncos could travel.
Yep, which is exciting. And I know George said that he feels good about the draft this year and the talent in the early rounds. So we'll see what they do here in a few weeks. Eric, appreciate you joining the show today.
You got it, Sid.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Broncos Now. Broncos Country, thanks so much for tuning in. I'll meet you right back here on the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube next week for another episode.